"No," said Alexander firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll find the surrogate mother myself." Across from him, his assistant and longtime confidant, Dr. Cassandra Blake, raised an eyebrow in mild surprise. "Oh, really?" she replied, her voice soft with amusement. "We could just go through a surrogate agency, you know. They'd make the process easier." Alexander leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms. "No," he repeated, more resolutely this time. "I want to handle this on my own. I want to personally choose the woman who will carry my child. This is too important to leave to a third party." Dr. Blake regarded him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod, understanding the depth of his desire for control in such a sensitive matter. "All right, I understand," she said calmly. A brief silence followed, filled with the hum of the air conditioner and the muffled city noises beyond the large office windows. After a pause, Alexander's voice cut through the quiet. "Thank you, Cassandra," he said, his expression softening. "I appreciate your help in all this." "Of course, Alexander," she replied with a small smile. "Call me any time. I'll help manage whatever part of the process you need me to." "Daddy Alexander," she teased playfully, her tone lightening the mood. Alexander chuckled briefly before ending the call. He had already made up his mind. This woman, the surrogate mother of his future child, would not be chosen by anyone else. He needed to feel certain, in his gut, that the person selected was not just medically capable, but someone who aligned with his vision of the future. He still hadn't fully defined what he was looking for, but he trusted a few people in his inner circle to assist in narrowing down the candidates. Later that day, one of his most reliable staff members called with news that made his breath catch. They'd found a woman. A potential surrogate had agreed to the arrangement. Alexander only had a photograph and a brief medical and personal background, but something about her stood out. She seemed healthy, balanced, grounded. An ideal candidate. He made a plan. She would be brought to one of his private guest houses, located well outside the city, where she could live comfortably and privately throughout the pregnancy. She would have everything she needed: medical care, nutritious food, a peaceful environment. And once the baby was born, she would be compensated generously, and Alexander would raise the child alone, without any further involvement from her. "All right, I'll call Dr. Blake," Alexander told his assistant, already on his way out of the office. The next morning, Dr. Cassandra Blake greeted him with a calm voice. "Hi, Alexander. Tomorrow I'll have someone named Julia Warren come in," he informed her. "Julia Warren?" Cassandra repeated, confirming the name. "Yes," Alexander said, his tone more serious now. "Julia Warren will be the surrogate mother of my future child." Cassandra nodded. "Understood. I'll take care of her personally." A small measure of relief passed through Alexander. Even though the woman hadn't yet gone through the necessary health screenings, he felt as if he were a step closer to fulfilling a dream that had long haunted his heart: becoming a father. Julia would be heading to the hospital the next day for her first appointment. Across town, in the modest bustle of the Willow Creek Flower Market, a young woman named Eliza Warren was arranging peonies with her mother. The small stall they operated together had been a part of their lives for years. The floral scent hung thick in the air as she wrapped a bouquet. "Eliza, are you going to the hospital tomorrow?" her mother Helen asked while snipping the ends of a few tulips. "No, Mom, I'm just going to visit someone," Eliza replied quickly, avoiding her mother's eyes. She wasn't ready to talk about it yet. "All right then, your father can come help me here," Helen said without missing a beat. Eliza nodded, forcing a polite smile that vanished the moment her mother turned away. She gently placed a hand on her lower abdomen, a subtle movement filled with concern. She hadn't told her mother she'd scheduled an appointment with a gynecologist. Something felt off, something she couldn't quite explain, and she needed to know what was happening inside her body. The next day, with her heart thudding nervously, Eliza approached the hospital. Her hands were pressed together, knuckles white, as she sat among other women in the waiting area. One by one, names were called, and slowly the room emptied. Eventually, only Eliza and another woman remained. The other woman, growing impatient, stood and muttered, "This is taking forever." Before exiting, just as the door swung shut behind her, a nurse appeared and called out, "Miss Eliza Warren?" Eliza stood, clutching her handbag. She threw a glance toward the door the previous woman had just exited, then followed the nurse down a long hallway. Inside, Dr. Cassandra Blake greeted her with a warm smile. "Hello, Miss Eliza Warren. Please, have a seat." Eliza felt a wave of shyness wash over her as she sat down. Under her breath, Cassandra murmured, "Alexander never told me you were this pretty." Eliza's brows furrowed. "Excuse me?" she asked uncertainly. "Oh, nothing," Cassandra said quickly. "Can we begin?" "Yes," Eliza nodded, though her heart was now pounding. Something about the interaction left her slightly uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. At the same moment, in a high-rise office in the heart of the city, Alexander was growing more anxious by the second. Today was the day. The day the surrogate mother of his child would undergo the procedure. His phone rang. He answered it without hesitation. "Hello, Alexander. It's Cassandra. Everything's done. The procedure with Miss Eliza Warren went smoothly. You can bring her to the guest house." Relief flooded his body. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "Thank you, Cassandra." "You're welcome," she said warmly. "If there's any problem, you know I'm just a call away. Daddy Alexander," she added teasingly before the line disconnected. Alexander smiled, then turned to his staff. "Go pick up Julia Warren, take her to the guest house and make sure everything is perfect." But just minutes later, his phone rang again. This time, it was one of his staff members sounding unusually alarmed. "Sir, Miss Julia says she never made it to the checkup." "What?" Alexander demanded. "Dr. Blake just told me the procedure was completed and she's ready to go." "Sir," the staffer insisted, "Miss Julia says she stepped out to use the restroom before the appointment. When she came back, a nurse told her she had missed her turn and to come back tomorrow." Alexander froze, his heart pounding. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath and hung up. Immediately, he called Dr. Blake. "Are you still at the hospital?" "Yes," she said, "but I'm heading to the ER right now for a surgery." "I'll wait for you in your office," Alexander replied, his voice tight. He slumped into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The plan was unraveling, and it hadn't even truly begun. If Julia hadn't undergone the procedure, then who had? When Dr. Blake finally arrived at her office, she found Alexander pacing. "Why did you rush over here?" she asked, seeing his tense face. "Something is wrong," he replied quickly. "Julia Warren never received the procedure." Dr. Blake blinked, stunned. "What are you talking about? Who received my sperm, Cassandra?" His voice was low but urgent. There was a moment of heavy silence before she swallowed hard and said, "Eliza Warren." Alexander pressed his hand to his forehead. "You made a mistake?" "Yes," she admitted softly, looking pale. "I think I did. I need to find her," Alexander said. "I need to know if the procedure was successful." "It's entirely possible she's pregnant," Cassandra said. She seemed perfectly capable. Back at the flower market, Eliza wrinkled her nose. "Ugh, that smells awful," she muttered, covering her face. "What do you mean? You've always liked these flowers," her father Samuel said, watching her with concern. Suddenly queasy, Eliza bolted for the small restroom in the back of their stall. Her parents followed, worry etched across their faces. "Eliza," her mother called from outside the door, "tell us the truth. Are you pregnant?" Staring at her own reflection in the mirror, Eliza felt panic rise in her chest. "Who's the father?" Samuel asked from the other room. "Is there someone we should know about?" "I don't have a boyfriend," Eliza insisted through the door. "Then how do you explain this?" Her father's voice grew louder. "I don't know," Eliza cried, sliding to the floor. "I swear, I don't know." Outside, Alexander's investigator called. "Sir, we've found her. Her name is Eliza Warren. She works at the Willow Creek Flower Market." "I'm on my way," Alexander said, heart pounding, as he started his car. Upon arrival, one of his staff pointed to a young woman arranging lilies. She was lovely, but clearly not the woman in the profile photo. This was Eliza, not Julia. "Should I speak to her?" one assistant asked. "No," Alexander said, stepping forward. "Well, I'll do it myself." He approached Eliza, whose eyes were red from tears. Just as she turned, she nearly collided with him. "Eliza Warren?" he asked in a low voice. Startled, she looked up. "Who are you?" Before he could answer, her father stormed forward. "Is this the guy who got you pregnant?" "Dad, I don't know him," she cried. "Maybe he's just a customer." "I'm not here to buy flowers," Alexander said firmly. "I need to speak with you." Her father lunged at him. "So you're the one?" "No," Alexander shouted. "You don't understand. I've never touched her." "Then how is she pregnant?" shouted a nearby friend of Eliza's. Alexander raised his hands. "It was an accident. Dr. Blake accidentally used my sample on her." Eliza gasped. Her mind raced. Could that be true? I'm here to take responsibility, Alexander said. Tension crackled in the air. Later, seated awkwardly in their small living room, Dr. Blake explained everything. If you agree, she said, Eliza would be the surrogate for Alexander's child. Do we have a choice? Helen asked. There's already a baby involved. We're not murderers, Samuel added. Blake bowed her head. I'm truly sorry, I'll compensate you, but please, let Alexander be a father. Even as the conversation continued, Eliza's world spun with confusion. I don't know, she said quietly, glancing at Alexander. It's okay, he said gently. Take your time. Then he added, but time's running out. Eliza felt the dizziness return. The last thing she remembered was collapsing into his arms. Yours? Eliza asked, her voice hesitant but laced with curiosity. A faint smile flickered on Alexander's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Welcome, Eliza, he said, gently taking her bags as they entered the grand vacation home nestled in the serene slopes of Crystal Pines, a luxurious mountain town not far from the city. The sun had just begun to set, casting long golden rays through the windows and wrapping the entire house in a warm, comforting glow. It was a beautiful place, designed to bring peace, rest, and privacy. Inside, two warm and respectful household helpers greeted them at the entrance, with slight bows and welcoming words. Eliza looked around, her eyes wide at the elegant design. The polished wooden floors, tall windows revealing snow-covered furs outside, and the faint scent of lavender from freshly laundered linen. Thanks for letting me stay here, she said quietly, turning to face him. There was a trace of gratitude in her eyes, but also uncertainty, like a bird unsure if its wings would hold in a sudden flight. Alexander offered a nod, his voice carrying a weight he didn't try to hide. It's nothing, he murmured. It's my responsibility, because of the baby. She noticed the way his eyes involuntarily drifted toward her stomach again, still flat, still without change. But it wouldn't be for long. Sir, I can take her bag, one of the helpers offered politely, stepping forward. As Eliza relinquished her grip on the handle, Alexander cleared his throat. I have to go, he said suddenly. Her head turned sharply toward him. Go? She repeated, her voice lifting. You're leaving me here? The words slipped out before she could stop them. Worry crept into her tone, soft but unmistakable. The idea of being left alone in a strange place, even one as beautiful as this, unnerved her more than she cared to admit. Yes, Alexander said, caught off guard by her reaction. I wasn't planning to stay just to get you settled. Eliza looked down, then slowly reached for his hand. Her fingers wrapped around his as if reaching for something solid in a world that had begun spinning too fast. I don't want to be alone here, she whispered, voice trembling. Please stay. Not used to being by myself. Alexander froze, the warmth of her touch traveling up his arm like a slow current. He stared at her hand in his, surprised at how natural it felt, and how badly he didn't want to let go. But Eliza noticed what she was doing and quickly pulled back, blushing fiercely. Sorry, she said, embarrassed. He looked down at his own hand, fingers still curled slightly, as if clinging to the ghost of her touch. A strange tightness built in his chest. I'll stay tonight, he said at last, his voice lower now, but I'll have to return to Manhattan tomorrow. Eliza's eyes met his. You'll stay? Tonight? He nodded gently, then turned toward one of the helpers. Is her room ready? Yes, sir, the helper replied. Good, please show her around. As Eliza followed the woman up the grand staircase, she cast a quick glance back at Alexander. Thank you, she said quietly. He merely gave a nod, watching her disappear down the hallway. A strange sense of protectiveness washed over him. Later that evening, Alexander stepped outside for a breath of fresh air and to make a quick phone call. His friend Jacob answered almost immediately. I heard you're in Crystal Pines with someone. Honeymoon already? Jacob teased. Shut up, Alexander muttered. Who told you? Dr. Cassandra, Jacob replied, amused. She said you're holed up with a pretty girl. Annoyed, Alexander ended the call. Just as he turned back toward the house, he nearly dropped the glass of warm milk he was carrying. Eliza had just stepped out of the bathroom wearing only a towel. Ah, I'm sorry, he gasped, immediately spinning around. I didn't know. Why didn't you knock? Eliza snapped, flustered and rushing to the bedroom to change. It was the first time she'd raised her voice at him, and it caught him off guard. His ears turned red. "Why are you yelling at me?" he asked, almost childishly, as she pulled on a loose blouse. "Why not?" she shot back. Alexander clamped his mouth shut, realizing this wasn't the time to argue. She was pregnant, possibly hormonal, and in a strange place. "Here," he said instead, setting the milk down on the side table. "It's warm." "Where are you going?" she asked as she saw him head toward the door. "To the other room. I figured you'd want some space." "Stay here," she said impulsively, startling even herself. "Sleep with me." Alexander froze. "What? I'm not used to sleeping alone," she confessed. "I usually sleep with my mom." "I know it's silly," he sighed, scratching the back of his head. "I'm not your mother, Miss Eliza." They stared at each other for a moment, caught in the tension between their shared reality and the surreal circumstances that brought them together. "Fine," he finally said. "I'll grab my laptop. Be right back." Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a soft breath. She didn't understand why she wanted him there. Maybe it was the child growing inside her. Maybe it was fear. Maybe something else. Later that night, Alexander found himself on the phone again with Cassandra. "Try to understand her," she said gently. "She's pregnant. Maybe she craves your presence. Who knows? You two might even end up together." "That's not funny," he replied sharply. "She's here because of the baby, that's all." "I don't believe in love anymore, Cass. It's just a story people tell themselves." "That's a sad story, Alex," she murmured. When he returned to her room, Eliza was already asleep. He moved quietly, pulling the blanket over her and watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She looked peaceful, kind, gentle. He could see the goodness in her innocence, her loyalty to her family. She'd be a good mother, and that, he reminded himself, was their only bond. The next morning, Alexander sat on the terrace with a steaming cup of coffee, gazing at the snowy mountains in the distance, when a shriek from inside startled him. "Please check on Miss Eliza," he called out to the helpers. Within seconds, one of them called back, alarmed. "Sir, she's vomiting." He dropped his cup and ran. He found Eliza hunched over the sink in the bathroom, trembling, her face pale. She rinsed her mouth and looked up at him with watery eyes. He handed her a tissue and stepped back, uncertain of what to say or do. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "Nauseous," she whispered. He knelt beside her, trying to meet her eye. "Is there anything you want? Anything that'll help?" "Sweet potato pie," she said quietly. "What?" He blinked. "With pickles. Like at Thanksgiving. My mom used to make it." Alexander was baffled. I've never heard of that." "Well, it's what I want," Eliza insisted, suddenly more animated. "If I don't get it, I won't eat." He sighed. "Sweet potato pie with pickles, right?" A while later, he returned with a plate of toast and fruit. "Here, have something while we wait. I ordered your pie, should be here soon." Eliza glanced at the food, then at him. "You really ordered it?" "Yes," he said, sitting beside her. She picked at the toast, then looked up. "Thank you." He gave her a soft smile, then shifted the glass of milk closer to her. Their eyes met, and Eliza gave a small, uncertain smile. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For being such a mess." "You're not the only one going through this," he replied. "But yeah, you're having a tougher time." Just then the door opened, and a voice rang out, cheerful and teasing. "Good morning." Alexander turned sharply. His expression darkened. "What are you doing here?" Jacob strolled in, his eyes twinkling. "Came to see my future niece or nephew and meet my sister-in-law." "Stop it," Alexander warned, blocking him. "Relax, I brought her the pie." He held up a plastic bag. Alexander snatched it, gave it a glance, and turned toward the stairs. "Emily," he called. "Mrs. Cooper is waiting for you upstairs." She nodded and left them alone. Jacob turned back, still smiling. "You really like being dramatic? But hey, you're gonna be a dad. Ever thought about being a husband too?" Alexander narrowed his eyes. "She seems sweet, and honestly, you two already have more chemistry than some couples I know." "She's just the surrogate," Alexander said flatly. Jacob raised his brows. "If that's how you feel, maybe I can introduce her to my single friends." "Don't even joke," Alexander growled. Jacob laughed, pulled him into a hug. All right. She's your surrogate, not mine." "Get out." Alexander pushed him toward the door. "And don't you dare introduce her to anyone." Back upstairs, Eliza wrinkled her nose as Alexander entered with the tray. "That smells awful," she said. What? Didn't you want this? I don't anymore. I want balut. Wait, what? He asked, blinking. You haven't even touched this food, and now? Balut? She nodded, clearly miserable. I'll be back, he said quietly, and stepped outside into the frosty evening. He looked up at the dark sky, wondering how in the world he was going to find fertilized duck eggs in a Colorado mountain town. This is insane, he muttered as he dialed Cassandra. Yes, Ethan? Where are you? You sound like you're freezing. I'm outside, looking for balut, she laughed. He didn't. That's her new craving? Yeah, and she didn't even try the yam pie, he said, frustrated. Hang in there, Cassandra said gently. She's still early in the pregnancy. This is what it's like. You'll get used to it. I hope so, he murmured, already feeling like the most exhausted, expectant father in the world. Even though she couldn't see him through the downpour, Eliza knew Alexander was out there somewhere in the storm because of her. He understood. Truly he did. She hadn't asked for any of this. Becoming a surrogate wasn't something she had imagined for herself, especially not under such circumstances. And now, as her body slowly began to change and her emotions fluctuated wildly, she felt unprepared. More than unprepared. She felt lost. Alexander, on the other hand, was only marginally more composed. The idea of fatherhood was something he'd yearned for, yes, but not like this, not accidentally, and not with a woman he barely knew. Still, he recognized that if this situation was daunting for him, it had to be twice as overwhelming for Eliza. So he pressed forward, determined to show up, determined to be present. Because no matter how unorthodox their bond was, it was bound by something real now, something growing. Back at the Crystal Pines home, Eliza sat curled on the living room couch, her eyes anxiously watching the long, rain-streaked window. Outside, the storm had grown worse, wind whistling through the pine trees, rain drumming heavily against the glass. But Alexander wasn't back yet. She tried not to worry, but the clock ticked past midnight, and dread grew heavy in her chest. He was out there, because she had asked for a very specific food craving, because she had wanted balut of all things, because she hadn't even realized the storm would be this bad when she mentioned it. "Alexander!" she cried, flinging the door open. The wind slapped her face and cold droplets immediately soaked her nightshirt, but she saw him, walking through the gate, umbrella barely shielding him from the sheets of rain. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stopping in his tracks as she rushed toward him. Neither of them spoke another word as he hurried forward, shielding her from the worst of the storm. Once inside, soaked and breathless, Alexander stood in the entranceway, his hair and clothes dripping, his boots tracking mud across the marble floor. "Oh God, you're drenched," Eliza said, rushing to grab a towel. She started patting him dry, her hands moving quickly but nervously over his shoulders, his arms, his hair. "I'm sorry," she added, voice cracking. "I made you go out just to buy something ridiculous in the middle of a storm." He speak instead. He looked at her, really looked at her. There was guilt in her eyes and shame. She was flustered, worried for him and trying hard to hide it. As she reached to towel his hair, their eyes met, soft and searching. Eliza's gaze dropped to his lips. She instinctively lowered her hand, ready to pull away, but Alexander didn't let her. Outthinking, he reached out and caught her wrist, and in the silence that followed, the only sound was the storm outside and the thunder of their hearts. His other hand moved to her cheek, his thumb brushing gently against her skin, and then, as if some unseen force drew them together, he kissed her. It wasn't soft, it wasn't calculated, it was impulsive, heated, and filled with 1,000 emotions neither of them understood. Eliza gasped, nearly stumbling back from the shock, but Alexander's arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her. His lips tasted like rain and coffee. She didn't know what she was doing, what they were doing, but it didn't matter, not in that moment. Oh my God, what on earth? The loud crash of a pot hitting the floor tore them apart. The older housekeeper, Ms. Agnes, stood frozen at the kitchen threshold, her eyes wide as saucers. "Sir?" she asked, blinking. "I thought she was just the surrogate mother." Eliza stepped back, heart racing. Alexander didn't answer. He just stood there, hair dripping, shirt clinging to his frame, chest heaving. Clearly, the housekeeper had overheard the conversation he'd had with Jacob earlier that morning. Eliza couldn't bear to look at either of them and rushed off to her room. The next morning, Alexander sat alone on the terrace, cradling a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The rain had lessened, now a soft drizzle against the pine trees, but his mind was anything but calm. He replayed the kiss over and over. Why did I do that? He pressed a hand to his forehead. Was it guilt? Attraction? Was it just the emotions of the moment? The worry, the tension, the intimacy of the storm? The kiss wasn't planned. He had simply been moved by the look on her face. How she cared. How she'd stepped into the rain for him. And he'd wanted, if only for a moment, to erase all their stress. And maybe, selfishly, his own? Still, he shook his head. Ridiculous, he whispered. She's the surrogate, nothing more. Eliza, her soft voice made him jump, and the coffee sloshed onto his lap. A damn hot hawk, he exclaimed, standing quickly, trying to shake the liquid off. Are you okay? She asked, stepping forward. He instinctively stepped back. Their eyes met, and then he looked away. I'm fine, he mumbled. She stared at him for a beat longer, then turned toward the misty horizon. She wasn't sure why she came out here. Maybe to see if he was all right. Maybe because the tension of last night lingered like a fog she couldn't escape, but now she regretted it. The silence stretched between them. You should go inside, Alexander said after a while. It's cold. It's okay, my parents and Travis are stopping by soon. His head jerked slightly. Travis? Your brother? No, she clarified. He's a friend. The words sat between them, uncomfortable and pointed. Friend, Alexander echoed it under his breath as if testing its taste. He was almost certain Travis was the guy who'd nearly taken a swing at him in the flower market. Right. Well, tomorrow we have your ultrasound back in the city. Okay, Eliza said, quietly retreating into the house. Moments later, her parents arrived. What a lovely place Mr. Alexander has brought you to, Helen remarked, her eyes soaking in the scenic view. Where is he? Samuel asked, peering toward the hallway. Probably working upstairs, Eliza answered, though she wasn't sure herself. Is he taking good care of you? Travis murmured as he leaned in close. Or is he being too rough? Stop, Eliza warned, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He might hear you. Too late. Alexander stepped onto the terrace just in time to see them standing close. His gaze locked onto the hand on Travis's arm, and he fought the wave of annoyance that rose within him. Good day, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, he said, forcing a polite tone. Oh, good day, Helen replied, startled. Sorry we dropped by unannounced. It's fine, he said, voice clipped. You're welcome to visit her any time. Are you sure you're taking good care of her? Travis said, voice dripping with sarcasm, draping an arm around Eliza's shoulders. Alexander clenched his jaw. He stepped forward. Excuse me, he said slowly, but the only thing that matters to me is the child, not Eliza. Travis stood taller, eyes narrowing. What exactly are you trying to say? Enough, Eliza interrupted, tugging at Travis's sleeve. But the damage was done. Alexander turned without another word and left. That night, as the stars blinked quietly over Crystal Pines, Alexander stood alone on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand. The world outside was hushed, but the war in his mind continued. Alexander? Eliza's voice was gentle, almost shy. He turned mid-sip and lowered the glass. Sorry about earlier, she said, stepping closer. Travis he really cares. Because you're friends, Alexander replied, fully turning to face her. Yes, she said, then paused. Travis is just a friend. Alexander said nothing for a moment, then shrugged. I don't care. Whatever's going on between you two is none of my business. But I don't want him visiting again. She blinked, stung by the tone. As long as you're carrying my child, you stay here, with me. After you give birth, you can hang out with whoever you want. Eliza's face fell. The words hit like stones. I understand, she said softly, holding back tears. I know my responsibility. I'm just carrying your child. That's good, he said flatly. The next day, they returned to the city for the ultrasound. The car ride was silent, tension thick between them. When they arrived at the clinic, Eliza gave a small wave to Dr. Cassandra Blake. Dr. Cassandra, she said gently, watching the warm embrace between her and Alexander. It stirred something uncomfortable in her chest. Hi, Eliza, Cassandra said warmly, taking her hand. Let's get you on the table. Eliza lay back, her heart pounding. Alexander stood beside her as the device moved across her belly. Look, Cassandra suddenly said, eyes wide. You're having triplets. Really? Alexander breathed. Eliza turned toward the screen, stunned. 3 healthy babies, Cassandra confirmed with a wide smile. Eliza stared at the screen, eyes brimming with tears. She felt Alexandra's hand slide into hers. "Eliza," he whispered, voice cracking. "Thank you." His sincerity undid her. She began to cry. Then, without thinking, he hugged her, and she, overwhelmed with emotion, hugged him back. As they drove home, Alexander smiled for the first time in days. "Let's stop at the mall," he said. They wandered through the shops, surrounded by laughter and chatter. Eliza placed a tiny baby hat on his head. "Oh, this is adorable," she giggled. He struck a pose and she laughed harder. "When will we know their genders?" she asked as they walked. "Not sure. Cassandra said it might be too early." She looked down. "Does it matter? They won't remember me anyway." He turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, Jacob appeared. "Brother," he greeted, glancing at Eliza's stomach. "Wow, that's grown fast." He reached out, but Alexander pulled Eliza back. "I'm the only one who can touch my kids," he said, mock annoyed. They laughed, and later over dinner, Jacob teased them. "I'm sure carrying triplets is tough," he said. "It is," Eliza replied, "but I think all the pain will be worth it when I see the kids." She froze. That wasn't part of the deal. She wasn't supposed to see them, not after birth, but the moment had taken her. Later, as they drove back to Crystal Pines, she said quietly, "Your brother's nice?" "Nicer than me," Alexander replied. "Obviously," she teased, and they laughed. Back at the house, Alexander handed her a paper bag. "For you," he said. Inside were clothes. "It's not much," he murmured, "but I just wanted to thank you." Her heart fluttered. "And I'm sorry, about the other night," she frowned. "What night?" "The night I kissed you." They both flushed. "Sorry," he repeated. "I didn't mean it." "You didn't mean it?" she echoed. Disappointment weighed down her voice. She shouldn't have cared, but she did. "I'm sorry," he added. "I know you're confused. Don't read into it." "Don't read into it," she repeated bitterly. "Yes, we have separate lives. You have Travis, I have Cassandra." Eliza interrupted quickly, refusing to acknowledge Alexandra's mention of Brianna, or Travis, for that matter. She didn't want to correct him anymore. What was the point? Alexander handed over the paper bag of clothes and quietly excused himself. "Get some rest," he murmured. Then he turned and left the room, gently closing the door behind him. Eliza stood still for a moment, holding the bag loosely in her hands. Then, slowly, she slumped against the closed door, her back pressing into the cool wood as she let out a long, tired sigh. She didn't understand her own feelings anymore. The kiss, the emotional roller coaster, the conversations, they all swirled around in her head like a storm. She was supposed to be just a surrogate. That had been the agreement, that was the line. But her heart hadn't signed anything. The next morning, Eliza found herself staring at her reflection for a long time. Her eyes looked different, brighter in some ways, heavier in others. She wanted to see Alexander, though she didn't know exactly why. Perhaps it was the pregnancy hormones, like everyone said. Or maybe it was more than that. But she couldn't bring herself to go downstairs. Not after the things they'd said. Not after he'd reminded her that their connection was purely transactional. Her cheeks still burned with embarrassment from that conversation. Still, as she sat back down on her bed, her hand moved automatically to her belly. It was rounder now, the signs of life growing unmistakably stronger with each passing day. She smiled faintly, whispering to her children. Yes, her children, even if she would never get to raise them. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Cooper, the kindly older housekeeper, entered with a plate of sliced fruit. "Good morning, ma'am," she said with a gentle smile, placing the plate on the side table. "Here's your breakfast." "Mrs. Cooper," Eliza blurted suddenly, her voice tinged with desperation. "Is there any way to stop a craving?" The woman paused, tilting her head. "Why would you want to stop a craving, miss?" Eliza looked down, cheeks flushing. "Because I'm not craving food," she said softly. "I'm craving Alexander." There was silence for a moment. Mrs. Cooper's eyes widened slightly, but then she smiled with motherly understanding. "I want to see him," Eliza continued, her voice quivering. "Be near him, smell his cologne. I don't know what's wrong with me." "That's perfectly normal," Mrs. Cooper said with a warm chuckle. "You're pregnant, dear, and with triplets no less. Your body's going through changes you don't even understand yet. Don't fight your emotions. The babies might get upset. Meanwhile, downstairs in the sunlit foyer, Alexander was pacing. He'd barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eliza's tearful face, or felt the ghost of her touch. He didn't know how to handle this. The emotions, the guilt, the strange tug of affection he hadn't expected. When Mrs. Cooper appeared at the bottom of the stairs, he rushed toward her. "Is Eliza awake?" he asked quickly, trying to keep his tone casual. "She is, sir," the woman replied. Then she lowered her voice with a conspiratorial smile. "In fact, she wants to see you, but she's too shy to say it." Alexander blinked. "She's craving you, sir," the housekeeper added, chuckling and nudging him lightly with her elbow. "Craving me?" He was so thrown by the idea that he immediately pulled out his phone and called Dr. Cassandra Blake. "Hey, Ethan, problem?" she asked, sounding slightly distracted. "Not exactly," he said, feeling a bit awkward. "I just have a question." "Go on," she encouraged. "You know you can ask me anything." "Is it possible for a pregnant woman to crave her partner?" he asked, hesitating. "Even if we're not exactly a couple?" There was a burst of laughter on the other end of the line. "Oh my God, Alex! Cassandra!" he snapped, half embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said, still chuckling. "It's just... You're asking if you are her craving? That's adorable." He groaned. "Listen," she continued, more seriously now. "There's no official research confirming that a husband or partner becomes a craving. But with pregnancy hormones, emotions can go all over the place. Sensitivities increase, mood swings, attachments, strange desires. They all make sense. She sees you every day," Cassandra added. "She's gotten used to your presence. And you're the one caring for her. Those heightened emotional states, they amplify the attachment." Alexander let out a long breath. "You're not her husband, sure, but you are responsible for her. You've been together through this strange journey. It's natural for her to want you around." "I get it," he said quietly. "Thanks, Cassandra." That evening, Alexander knocked lightly and stepped into Eliza's room with a tray of warm food. She looked up in surprise as he entered. "Let's eat," he said softly, sitting down on the edge of her bed. He handed her a spoon and she took it without a word. "Mrs. Cooper told me you're craving me," he added, a small teasing smile on his lips. "Not at all," Eliza blurted out, face turning crimson. Her tone was so defensive that it made him laugh. "It's fine," he said, still smiling. "At least our kids will be gorgeous." "What do you mean, our kids?" she snapped, suddenly serious. "Don't forget, you're just letting me carry them. The moment they're born, you'll take them and pay me, right? Like a transaction." Alexander's smile vanished. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Why'd you pick me, Alexander?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "You're rich. You have a name. You could have found a wife, built a family the normal way." He looked down, ashamed. "I messed up once," he admitted quietly. "Your fiancée?" Eliza guessed. "She left you?" He nodded. "At the altar." "I felt betrayed," he continued. "Love? It doesn't last. It's like food that spoils, or medicine with an expiration date. Sooner or later, people get sick of you. But I still wanted a child. That part never changed. I just couldn't imagine building a life with someone if I wasn't sure their love would last." Eliza swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "That's really sad," she said gently. "All because one person hurt you, you won't even try again. That's too bad. Love is the most important thing. It can't be explained, it just is." "I've never been hurt like you," she continued. "But even if I was, I wouldn't regret it, because I would love sincerely. That's what matters." She looked him straight in the eye. "If one mistake scared you that much, I think you're the one who's unlucky, because now you'll never get to feel love again." Suddenly, she gasped, clutching her belly. "What's wrong?" Alexander shot forward, alarmed. "My stomach. It hurts," she whimpered, tears welling in her eyes. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her. "Hold on," he whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "You're going to be okay." Since Cassandra was out of town for a medical conference, she sent a trusted colleague to check on Eliza. As the examination ended, Alexander paced the hallway outside, anxiety gnawing at him. "How is she? How are the babies?" he asked the doctor, his voice trembling. "She's okay for now," the woman said calmly. "But you should know this is a high-risk pregnancy. Triplets are already rare, and with the unexpected insemination, her body's under immense strain." She needs complete bed rest, she added, and your full support. When Alexander returned to the room, Eliza was sleeping, a pale IV attached to her wrist. He sat beside her, gently picked up her hand, and pressed it to his lips. "I'm sorry, Eliza," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "If I could take all this pain away from you, I would." A knock interrupted the moment. "Sir," a staff member said, "her parents are here." Alexander stood and made his way downstairs, only to be greeted by George's booming voice. "What did you do to my daughter? She's clearly stressed out. He must be messing with her," Travis added, before being silenced by Karen's sharp look. "Stop it," Karen snapped. Then she turned to Alexander, her expression softer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Alexander. We came as soon as we heard. How is she?" "She's resting now," Alexander replied, his voice quiet but resolute. He looked George in the eye. "It might be my fault, but—" "Of course it is," George shouted. "If it wasn't for you and that idiot doctor, she wouldn't be in this situation. Of all women, you had to choose my daughter." Travis stepped forward. "What happens after she gives birth? You just send her away like none of this ever happened? What's going on here?" A new voice interrupted Jacob. He walked into the room, immediately putting himself between Alexander and Eliza's family. "Why are you all ganging up on my brother?" "It's fine," Alexander said quickly. "They're just worried about Eliza." Jacob relaxed and turned to his brother. "How is she?" "She had some contractions. The doctor said her pregnancy is delicate." Jacob placed an arm around him in silent support. Alexander took a breath and looked around. "I want to apologize. I never meant for any of this. I never wanted her to suffer. But if this mistake hadn't happened, I never would have met her. I wouldn't have found someone so worthy of being the mother of my children." "I promise," he said solemnly, "I will not risk her life. I'll do anything for her." Everyone fell silent. Even George looked moved. Karen reached out and placed a gentle hand over Alexander's. "We're with you," she whispered. Hours passed. When Eliza finally opened her eyes, the room was quiet. She turned and saw Alexander slumped in a chair beside her, fast asleep. Slowly, she reached out and ran her fingers through his hair, then pressed her hand against her belly. If only things were different. If only he could love her. Because she realized, in that quiet moment, that she had fallen in love with him. "Eliza?" Alexander stirred, waking. She quickly wiped away her tears. "I'm fine." "What did the doctor say?" she asked. "High risk," he admitted. "You need bed rest." She nodded. "Whatever it takes." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he said softly. Days turned into weeks. Her belly grew larger. Her love for Alexander grew deeper. He was gentle, attentive, almost like a husband. But she couldn't tell if it was for her or for the babies. He tried not to mind, but time was slipping through her fingers. Sitting with him in the blooming garden one afternoon, she began to cry. "Why are you crying?" he asked, gently brushing her tears. "I'm scared," she said. "Of labor?" "No," she whispered. "Of what comes after? I know we had an agreement, but I've felt so much carrying your children. I feel like they're mine, but I know I'm not yours." Alexander stared, unsure of how to respond. "In life," she murmured, "we don't always get what we want, but just for now, I'm a mother." Tears ran down her cheeks. Before he could speak, the door flew open. Travis arrived, beaming, with a bag of gifts. Jacob followed, laughing, an arm thrown over Travis's shoulder. Inside, behind the glass walls, Alexander watched them, and Jacob's voice rang beside him. "You know, bro," he said, "life is always a gamble," Jacob said quietly, watching his brother as they stood by the glass wall overlooking the garden. Arms folded tightly across his chest, Alexander stared into the distance, jaw tight, brow furrowed. "He didn't answer," Jacob continued. "If you keep playing it safe, you'll never really live. You can't protect yourself from pain. It's everywhere, but it's worth it when you go through it with someone you love." Alexander's gaze flicked briefly toward him. "If you keep denying yourself the chance to love again," Jacob added, voice low and honest, "your life here on earth won't mean much. You'll be rich, maybe, accomplished, but empty. Love is what makes the world spin. Without it, your world stays cold, dark, and full of fear." He nodded toward the window, where Eliza sat beneath the shade of a flowering dogwood tree, a soft smile on her face as she cradled her pregnant belly. His children. Eliza is worth the risk. You know that. You've always known it. Now tell me, can you live with the thought of someone else holding her, raising a family with her, loving her when you didn't? Alexander didn't speak, but inside a storm raged. He didn't need to answer. His silence was loud enough. The very idea sent a jolt of something fierce, something possessive and tender straight through his chest. Within a few days, they moved back to Alexander's main residence in the heart of the city. Eliza was approaching her due date, and the high-risk nature of her pregnancy meant she needed to be closer to the private hospital where Dr. Cassandra worked. The transition back to city life felt surreal, familiar yet foreign, as if they were returning from another world. "Cassandra's stopping by later to check on you," Alexander said one afternoon, as he gently helped Eliza ease herself onto the bed. Her belly was enormous now, and even the smallest movements took effort. "Is she visiting me or you?" Eliza teased under her breath, not realizing Alexander had heard her. He blinked, slightly startled. "What?" She tilted her head innocently. "What are you implying?" he asked, voice tight. "Nothing," she replied with a shrug. "It's just, when Travis drops by, you always give me a look, yet you talk to Cassandra every day." "We talk about you, Eliza," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Well, why not just ask me directly?" she snapped. "I'm right here. I can answer for myself." "And how am I supposed to talk to you?" Alexander shot back, "when Travis is always hanging around. What's your problem with him?" He laughed bitterly, looking away. "What's your problem with Cassandra?" Eliza drew in a shaky breath. "Travis is the only one who helps me feel less stressed. He actually listens, and unlike you, he has a plan for what happens to me after I give birth." "A plan I can't give you?" Alexander demanded, spinning back to face her. Her eyes widened. "What? What? Does he want to marry you?" Alexander shouted, exasperation and pain mixing in his voice. "Because I can do that too. You want me to marry you, Eliza? I'll do it right now." The room fell into a stunned silence. Eliza opened her mouth, but no words came out. Before she could respond, a sudden contraction gripped her abdomen, and she gasped in pain. "Ah!" she whimpered, clutching her belly, panic spreading across her face. Alarmed, Alexander rushed to her side. I'm sorry," he stammered. "Maybe I stressed you out. Are you okay? Are you in pain?" She nodded through tears. "I think I'm going into labor, but it's still a week early," he whispered in disbelief. He took her hand, holding it tightly. "Okay, I'll call the car," he said, fumbling for his phone as he helped support her trembling frame. Minutes later, Jacob was behind the wheel, driving like a man possessed as Eliza lay in the back seat. Alexander never let go of her hand. "You're doing great," he whispered. "Almost there, Eliza. Just hang on." Inside the hospital, chaos surrounded them. Nurses wheeling Eliza down the corridor, doctors shouting orders, everything blurred. Alexander's voice was the only thing anchoring her. "Eliza," he called, jogging beside the stretcher. "I'll be right here, I promise." He kissed her forehead as they reached the delivery room doors. Then, as she disappeared inside, he staggered back, overcome by a wave of fear. He ran a trembling hand over his face and leaned into Jacob, who caught him with steady arms. A few seconds later, Karen and George arrived and embraced him too. Moments later, Dr. Cassandra appeared. "Cassandra!" Alexander shouted, his voice cracking. "Where is she? How's Eliza?" "She's having some trouble delivering," the doctor said grimly. "What about my grandchildren?" George asked, his voice firm. "Keep them safe," Alexander pleaded, gripping Cassandra's arm. "Please?" "We'll do our best," she said. "Do you want to go in with her?" A nurse asked him. Without hesitation, Alexander nodded. Inside the delivery room, Eliza was drenched in sweat, her breathing ragged. Pain racked her body. "Eliza," Alexander whispered, suddenly beside her, his hand cradling her head. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere," she sobbed, fingers lacing through his. He kissed her cheek. "You can do this. You're stronger than anyone I know." Dr. Cassandra's voice rang through the room. "Good job, Eliza. One more push. Baby number 1 is coming out." Alexander leaned in, whispering encouragement. "Go, go, baby." Eliza focused on the ceiling and pushed with everything she had. And then, finally, she heard it. A high-pitched, beautiful cry. The first baby had arrived, but then everything went black. When she woke again, her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her mother's face hovered above her. "Eliza?" Karen said, brushing her daughter's hair gently from her forehead. "Mom," Eliza rasped, "the babies? Are they okay?" Karen and George exchanged a quick look. "I know they're with Alexander," she added, trying to stay calm. "Just tell me they're safe, right?" "They're fine, sweetheart," George said softly, his eyes misty. "All 3 boys. You delivered them safely." Eliza broke into tears. Relief, heartbreak, everything hit her all at once. She had done it. She had brought them into the world, and now her part was done. "Mom, can we go home now?" she asked in a whisper. Karen hesitated. "We still have to talk to—" "I just want to go," Eliza said more firmly, eyes glistening. So, with great effort, they helped her into a wheelchair, and together they rolled her through the hospital corridors. Tears slipped down her cheeks the whole way, because she knew in her soul, that this was the end. And it hurt far worse than she'd ever imagined. She wasn't just saying goodbye to Alexander, she was saying goodbye to her sons. The babies she'd carried for 9 months, whose heartbeats she had felt, whose kicks had kept her awake, whose lives had grown from her own. She may have been just the surrogate in the legal sense, but her heart knew otherwise. They were hers, and she was theirs. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a gift. Outside the hospital, as the chilly breeze kissed her face, Karen adjusted the wheelchair's blanket. "Eliza!" a voice called. She froze. Alexander came running toward them, out of breath, eyes frantic. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Back to my old life," she said softly, her vision blurring again. "Why? Don't you want to stay with me? With our children?" She looked up at him, heart aching. "Shouldn't I be asking you that?" "The life I wanted," she continued, "was a family, but you said that once I gave birth, I'd walk away. I'm just doing what you asked." "No," Alexander whispered. He stepped forward and cupped her face, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "But I want you to stay, Eliza. I want to be with you, with our children." He grasped her hand tightly. "I love you, and I need you." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "You're the only one I want to trust again," he added. "The only one I want to believe in. Don't let me lose this chance," he pleaded. She shook her head through her tears. "I won't." Alexander leaned in and kissed her, gently, reverently. Then he slipped a ring onto her finger. "I love you, Eliza." Her lips trembled. "I love you too, Alexander." He didn't wait for anyone's approval. He scooped her into his arms as their families watched, overwhelmed. Karen wiped her eyes. George placed a hand on Travis's back, who, despite everything, blinked rapidly, holding back tears. That same afternoon, Eliza finally held her sons in her arms. 3 beautiful baby boys, Anthony, Arthur, and the youngest, named after his father, Alexander. A year later, the once scared, emotionally scarred man who had only wanted an heir had transformed. He didn't just have children, he had a family. They lived together in Crystal Pines, building new memories in the place where everything had started. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Eliza sat by the window, watching her husband chase their boys through the backyard. She smiled, remembering the journey, the pain, the hope, the kiss that changed everything. What had once felt like an accident turned out to be destiny. Alexander used to believe he only wanted a child so he could pass on his name, but now he understood. He hadn't needed an heir. He had needed her. And love, unpredictable, inconvenient, miraculous love, had brought them full circle. The heir story, once tangled with mistakes and misunderstandings, had become something beautiful. And so, they lived not just happily ever after, but completely together. And that was the incredible journey of Alexander and Eliza. 2 people brought together by a twist of fate, separated by fear, and ultimately reunited by love. What began as an accident turned into a family, reminding us all that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead us exactly where we're meant to be. This story isn't just about romance or parenthood. It's about healing, forgiveness, and the courage to open your heart again. Because love doesn't always arrive the way we expect, but when it's real, it's worth everything. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of the story touched you the most? Have you ever been afraid to love again after being hurt? And what would you do if you found yourself in Eliza's shoes? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that stay with you long after the video ends.